Welcome back, Ketodontist listeners. This is your host, Dr. Matt, back with episode 5 of the podcast. Today is part 1 of our interview with Amy Berger of To It Nutrition and author of the book, The Alzheimer's Antidote. Before we get started with that, first I wanted to have a correction and an apology with my last episode, episode 4, with Craig and Tara from Superhero Makers. My correction is that when Craig was talking about testing his ketone levels after he had a day full of like 5 pints of Ben & Jerry's, I was referring to his levels as therapeutic levels of ketones, and that's actually incorrect to a point. What I should have been saying was that he was in still a nutritional level of ketosis. Now, there's a little bit of a difference between nutritional ketosis and therapeutic ketosis. Nutritional ketosis is thought to have start at a reading of about 0.5 millimolars when testing blood ketones. Okay? Therapeutic levels are considered a higher level of blood ketones. So those will read anywhere between 1.5 to 3 millimolars. So when Craig was testing and he said he was testing at about 0.8 or 1 or something like that, he wasn't quite in therapeutic levels, but he'd still be considered in nutritional ketosis. Now, my source for this was Stephen Finney's speech, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living and Performance. That video is on YouTube if you want to watch it. I think it was filmed at Low Carb Down Under, and it's around minute marker 18. So if you want to look that up, he has a nice little slide breaking that down. Secondly, I want to apologize for the sound quality of the last episode. I was recording that intro at about 5 in the morning, and so my room where I record this at home is right next to Hazel's bedroom, so I couldn't speak too loud because I didn't want to wake her up. And then secondly, my original audio recording, the file became corrupted. I have an external recorder that I funnel everything through, and it saves it to an SD card, and that file ended up becoming corrupted and not usable. So I had to use the backup audio that was being saved directly onto my computer, but that audio isn't as good, it isn't as clear. That's why I used the external recorder. And also, it wasn't picking up the microphone that was right in front of my face. It was picking up the microphone that was feeding into Skype, because I have 2 microphones. And so if I turn my head to get a drink or something, if I wasn't talking right in that general direction, I was very low volume. So that's so I want to apologize for that. I'm glad I had that backup recording. That's why I do 2 recordings, but it was hard to listen to, and I fully apologize for that. Checking in right now, I'm still at about 300. I'm 300.5 or something like that. It's not quite the weekend. I'm recording this intro on Thursday, even though the episode will not be out till Monday. So it hasn't been quite a full week yet. I want to let you know boot camp starts on Monday. If you didn't hear last week's check-in, I signed up for the Keto Gains boot camp, and it starts this next Monday, which is the 24th of July, and it's already full up. And I also want to say that we are proud to sponsor someone. I don't know who my sponsorship went to, but the Keto Gains group is pretty cool in that the group themselves will pay for a couple people's way, and then other people who want to sponsor attendees can do so. So folks who want to make a change, but due to life circumstances or whatever, the funds just aren't quite there to do so, you can sponsor somebody and pay their way. And so we have sponsored somebody, and we'll let you know if we find out more information as we go. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we get to part one of our interview with Amy, which is an audio only, by the way. So YouTube guys, you're not going to see video for that part. But I have an upcoming Q&A episode where we got a lot of questions, and I want to dive into those answers. But I had a question put to me on the Facebook page that I wanted to go ahead and talk about real quick. So the question is from Anna. She asks, "Dear Matt, in your episode with Louis Villaseñor, you guys talked about counting calories. But I thought the magic of keto was that you didn't have to count calories. If I'm having to count and measure my food, what's the point of doing keto?" That's a great question. First off, I want to say that the reason I believe in keto or low carb and becoming fat adapted, one of the biggest reasons, not only that it reduces your insulin levels to where you can access stored body fat more readily, but the fact that you become fat adapted and keto adapted is it blunts hunger. It has been shown in multiple studies that it does a great job on blunting hunger. So it's a heck of a lot easier to be in a calorie deficit or not eat a whole lot if you're not hungry. It makes fasting easier. It makes eating smaller meals easier if you're not hungry. So that is one of my biggest reasons for going keto. That and I feel better, mental clarity, all that stuff. But this brings me to another topic that I want to discuss. And that is, there seems to be these camps in keto that fall on opposite ends of the spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have folks touting that calories don't matter. It's all about hormones, namely insulin. Once you get those right, you'll lose weight. You can eat all the butter and oils that you want, and you can eat to satiety. And that's great. You can get good results doing that approach, an unmeasured approach. Then you have the opposite ends of the spectrum where you have these folks, it's all about calories. The if it fits your macros group that it says that it doesn't matter what you eat as long as you're in a calorie deficit, you'll lose weight. And honestly, I'm kind of in the middle. I feel like sometimes, not to get in a pity party, but I feel like I'm on my own little island sometimes because I'm not really dogmatic towards either approach. Some folks, with an unmeasured response, especially if it's their first time ever going low carb or going keto, they can lose tons of weight really quickly, get their blood pressure correct, get their blood sugars and diabetes under control, get off all sorts of meds, and they're good. And that's cool. If that works for you and that's where you get to, and you're happy and you don't necessarily want to lose any more weight, you're feeling good, by all means, let your freak flag fly. That works for you. The issue that I see, though, with a lot of folks, and I'm speaking from experience because this is what happened to me, is that you'll have a bunch of weight initially lost, be feeling better and all that stuff, but then you hit a plateau and you don't move. And when you get to that point, you have to ask yourself, do I need to change? There's that saying, what got us here won't get us there, and that's the way I look at it. When I started back on keto, I lost 30 pounds in like 2 months, and I lost another 10 pounds in another 2 months. So in 4 months, I lost 40 pounds. And then I stayed, and I stayed, and I stayed. For about a year, the scale didn't move. And it wasn't until recently that I varied my approach. I took a more measured and calculated way of doing things. Started tracking my foods, tracking my calories, and also added more exercise, more weightlifting in particular, that then I busted through that plateau. When I started this podcast, I was weighing around 313, and now I'm right at 300. And so in a month, that's 13 pounds down. And so if you want to when you're first giving keto a try, and you don't necessarily, you kind of want to dip your toe in the water, then by all means, just cut out carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates, eat, starting out, just have your carbohydrates come from just trace amounts that's found in like green leafy vegetables and non-starchy vegetables like cauliflower, and eat plenty of protein, dairy if you're okay with dairy, fats, do all of that stuff. That's fine, but you may get to a point after a few months that no longer quite does the trick for you. And that's what happened to me. And that's why I am changing directions a little bit. I'm still going keto, I'm still going low carb, but it's more of a measured approach. And that's why over this next year, my hypothesis is that by tracking my calories, by increasing resistance training, that I will bust through my plateaus and get to where I need to be. And I'm going to be a great guinea pig for you guys. So if you're not quite sure if you want to do this, just follow my journey and we'll see how it works. But over this next year, I'm committing to a measured approach. I also have some stuff coming up with, if you guys listen to episode 1 with Marty Kendall from Optimizing Nutrition, him and I have been having a lot of back and forth. He's reading my tracking, my food trackers. We've started also measuring blood ketones and blood sugar at different intervals. We'll see if there's any in-depth lab studies that we want to do, lab workups that we want to do, but we don't have it quite fine-tuned yet, but we're going to be working on some stuff that should make for a pretty interesting case study. So I'll let you guys know as that develops. But long story short, there are authorities in this health and nutrition that I'm going to be going not against, because I like to focus on our similarities and our common ground. But some of the information I'm going to be presenting is going to be countercurrent to kind of what's considered mainstream keto. Now, keto is pretty countercurrent anyway, but there's a train of thought that calories don't matter and it's all about hormones, and that's kind of the mainstream of keto, and I might be going countercurrent to that. We'll see if it works or not. Like I said, I'll be a great guinea pig for you guys. So I wanted to get that out of the way, and we'll talk about that more probably in later episodes. But without further ado, let's get to part 1 of a 2-part interview with Amy Berger from To It Nutrition and author of the Alzheimer's Antidote. I hope you enjoy. All right. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Ketodontist Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Matt. I have to say, I am super, super excited for today's guest. I just finished her book a couple weeks ago before this recording, and I actually was so enthralled with it that I went back a second time, busted out my highlighter, and now it's just the whole book is basically orange because I was just highlighting the heck out of it. So excited for our guest today. Her name is Amy Berger. She recently has a new book out called The Alzheimer's Antidote, and I have to say, this is probably my favorite book on this whole kind of low carb ancestral health, little bit of keto. But as far as a book that really breaks down the science, and it's geared towards Alzheimer's and dementia and cognitive decline, but it has such broader range than that, and really opened my eyes, even though I've been studying this stuff for years now. Really helped me connect some pieces. It has become one of my favorite all-time nutrition books. So say hi to everybody, Amy.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that introduction about my book. I'm so flattered that you highlighted so much of it. I have books like that myself.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely wonderful. Like I said, I was just reading through it, and then in prep for this, I read through, finished it the first time about a month ago, and then in preparation for this interview, I went through and reread it again in a span of 10 days, and I just had busted out my highlighter and all that stuff. So, no, it was great. Really looking forward to getting into this with you, Amy. I'll give the audience a little bit of a background here. Amy has a master's in human nutrition. She's an Air Force veteran. She's a certified nutrition specialist and a nutritional therapy practitioner who specializes in using low-carbohydrate nutrition to help people reclaim their health and vitality. She loves showing them that getting and staying well doesn't require starvation, deprivation, or living at the gym. Her motto is, "Real people need real food." She blogs at toitnutrition.com, which we'll have in the show notes, a link to that, where she writes about a wide range of health and nutrition-related topics, such as insulin, metabolism, weight loss, thyroid function, and more. She is the author of The Alzheimer's Antidote, using a low-carb, high-fat diet for fighting Alzheimer's disease, memory loss, and cognitive decline. Amy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I am so thrilled to be here.
Yeah, likewise. So, before we really start nerding out on the science, I really like when I interview someone, really learning about the person, what makes them tick, what got them started in health and nutrition and becoming a master in their craft. So tell us a little bit about yourself. When did you first become interested in nutrition science? What got you started down that path? Tell me a little about yourself.
Sure. I started out like a lot of people do who come into this, whether it's professionally or just as a personal interest. I was a chubby kid. I was a chubby kid and I was a chubby young adult, and I liked nothing more than sitting down in a comfy chair with my face in a book. And I still do. That's still my favorite thing to do. But as I got older, as I got into high school and college, I became more active. I started exercising, started running, started, watching my diet a lot more, lots of whole grains, lots of low fat, margarine, all that kind of thing. And despite all that, I could never lose weight. No matter how hard I worked, no matter what I did, I was still heavier than friends of mine and acquaintances who I knew ate garbage and didn't exercise.
Right.
And unfortunately, I spent many, many years beating myself up for it, feeling like a failure, feeling like it was my fault, and just really, really hating myself. And I still struggle with that, to be honest with you, but I finally put two and two together and said, this isn't working. I'm exercising. I've run marathons. Why am I still chubby? What's wrong here? And serendipitously, I stumbled upon Dr. Atkins's New Diet Revolution, the 1992 version of that book,
Yep.
and it just made sense to me. It
Right.
made sense of why and how carbohydrate reduction works, and it was scary because it was so opposite of everything that I had been led to believe and everything, they with a capital T were telling us about how to
Yes.
lose weight and how to be healthy.
Mm-hmm.
But I tried it because I was really just at the end of my rope. And it worked, of course. And it didn't stick the first time. I did have to sort of implement it a couple of times before it stuck permanently. But over the years, my interest in it has expanded a lot, far beyond weight loss. I mean, when you look at all the other things that this way of eating does in the body, I would say that fat loss is like the least impressive thing that this
Right.
diet can do for your health and for your body. Um, and I just, it's just so fascinating to me. And I've had a lot of other jobs, a lot of different sort of careers that I never found fulfillment in and I wasn't happy with. And it occurred to me that I could make a living doing this. People are nutritionists. I could help other people learn about low carb. And so that's where I am now.
Yeah, that's awesome, and I totally agree. It's so funny how that new Atkins diet revolution, because I can't remember I can't remember if it was the '92 release or it was if they re-released a different edition in '99, but I got my hands on it in '99, and I was like you. I grew up severely. Well, you were a little bit, overweight. I was morbidly obese as a kid,
Mm-hmm.
and I learned about it. I learned about it when I was going into high school. I learned about it my freshman year of high school, and at that time I was well over 300 pounds, and over towards the end of my freshman year, I started going low carb, and then I come back. I started that probably around March or April. I come back into sophomore year, and I was over 320. I don't know how heavy I got because the scale only went up to 320. But I got back to school that sophomore year, and I was like down to 240. And so people that hadn't seen me all summer was just like, holy cow. And so here I was, a freshman in high school going into sophomore, and I read that book cover to cover, and it's kind of sad when at that age you've learned more about nutrition and and the role of insulin and how it plays in the body than the vast majority of people. And it just started me on an early path, like, why are we not talking about this?
Yeah, I have to say I was lucky in that all, quote unquote, all I had to deal with was being overweight. I didn't have any serious health issues, but there's no doubt in my mind that if I had continued to eat the way I was eating, I would have developed some really serious problems. I mean, I have a family history of type 2 diabetes, obesity, stroke. So I'm glad I found it when I did, but yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I wish I had found it sooner.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's one of those things that, well, you gotta live by example, and it's one of those things you wish that you could instill this energy, this excitement about what you learn into other people, like loved ones who have the same risk factors that you do. And it can be difficult when you offer to give them a book or something, or to help them out, but they're just not there themselves, and that's okay. We don't want to be too preachy about it, but yeah, it's one of those things that when you find this passion about it and you want to help people, you also have to realize that they might not be to that point yet, and that's okay, but hopefully you can live by example and give enough encouragement that they start kind of asking questions.
Exactly. Yeah, there's no quicker way to turn somebody off to this than to become kind of like a religious zealot about it and be in
Mm-hmm.
their face all the time. It's like you said, the best way is to lead by example. We see on the internet all the time, how do I get my dad on board? How do I get my wife to do this?
Yep.
You don't. You don't. You
Exactly.
let them come to you when they're ready.
Right. Yep. And you help them out when they ask for it, but until
Yeah.
then. Yep. So, well, very cool. So take us a little bit more about down your journey as far as when you were going into college and everything, the route you chose for your nutritional education and study. Tell me a little bit about
Oh,
that.
sure. I got my degree in nutrition sort of much later in life. I went to undergrad for something completely unrelated. I did one semester of graduate school for international relations. Then I joined the Air Force. I did not go to nutrition school until about 2011.
I see.
And I was in my 30s already by that point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I used my GI Bill, which was pretty great. And the reason I even went to school, I I was lucky in that I went to nutrition school after I already knew a lot about the science of low carb. I was already reading papers. I was already listening to all the podcasts and blogs that were out there, and I already knew some of the mechanisms of how and why this works. And the main reason I went to school is because for me personally, I felt like I would be more confident as a practitioner, as a professional, with those letters after my name. I mean, I will say, though, that there are so many people with no formal training whatsoever who are brilliant. I mean, they know far more than I do.
Yep.
And so that's not to say that anyone needs an official certification. I just knew that for me personally, I would feel better if I had it. So I went to I did get an actual master's, and then I did the nutritional therapy practitioner training, which is, not fully accredited anywhere. It's just it's a very good program, very educational, and it gave me sort of the more holistic piece. That word is so misunderstood and fuzzy, but I mean,
everybody automatically thinks holistic equals woo when it just means looking at things in a total picture, a big picture approach.
Yeah, so I felt like the master's program gave me a good grounding in the actual science, the biochemistry, the physiology, but then the NTP helped me sort of learn how to work with the whole person.
Right. Now, very cool. So, you took this after your training and everything. When did you start blogging through this process? When did you start getting into writing the book? Tell me a little bit about that.
If I remember right, I started blogging either right at the end of when I was still in school or maybe right after. And it didn't really take off until maybe mid to late 2013. Now I have a small but very loyal following, and I just wrote. Like, I didn't wait for things to be perfect. I didn't wait till I had a name. I just was like, I'm just going to blog, And now that I have so many blog posts, it's easy for me to link to old things. But I knew nobody could find me if there was nothing to find,
Right.
So now I do have some content out there. I didn't start seeing clients until kind of early to mid 2013, and then I was brand new, so it was very slow going, and it took time to build. And even now, seeing clients is a very small part of my sort of career, so to speak. It's not the main thing that I do. I am open to more clients. I would like to get more clients, but I think that just takes a really long time to build. And so most of my professional life right now is freelance writing in the nutrition and health world, but it's mostly writing.
Gotcha. Well, with your coaching and your clients, do you do local work? Do you do remote work, like via phone and Skype and all that stuff? When you look for clients, are they local, or are you kind of reaching a broader network?
It's both. Every now and then I see somebody locally. Most people find me online. They find me, I guess, through my blog or searching for like a keto-friendly nutritionist. So I see people all over the country via phone or Skype. I've even had some overseas consultations with Skype, but I do like meeting people in the local area because, I am very old-fashioned, and I like sitting down face-to-face with somebody, especially when you're talking about health or nutrition or weight. It's very important to actually look at somebody. And
Right.
like from you looking at somebody's mouth, looking at their teeth, if somebody can tell me what's going on, they can tell me how they look, but it is very different when I actually see it for myself.
Right.
And that's hard to do with somebody distant. Even you can be on a video, and even then it's really not, you don't get the full picture of what they really have going on. And it's a very Eastern medicine thing. They look at your tongue, they look at your eyes, they look at your nails. And I feel like that's something that's lost when you have an online relationship.
Yes, exactly. I agree with you, and I think I love modern technology. Don't get me wrong. I mean, without modern technology, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation, over Skype, and I wouldn't be able to record it the way I do and all that stuff. So I'm very thankful for it. But in that whole thing, we lose that connection with people, I think. And so I agree. I still I coach clients as well, but I'm a very rural area, so most of my people are remote. But I do love when I get to actually sit down with somebody and really hash stuff out, just next to each other at a table or or go over some stuff physically at a gym together. That's my favorite thing.
Yeah, it's the relationship is just different when you've been with somebody in person. Even after that, if you're on the phone or emailing, the dynamic is different just because you've been face to face, I think.
Exactly. Very cool. So
Yeah.
when did you become interested in the etiology of Alzheimer's and cognitive decline and how that relates to our diet?
I have no family history of Alzheimer's, so it was never really on my radar. I read the book Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes, which your listeners are probably familiar with, or if they're not, they should be.
Go read that book and Nina Teichol's Big Fat Surprise. You read those two books, and you're not going to be the same person afterwards.
No. And the first thing you'll do is throw your margarine in the trash and go buy butter. But I read that book around 2008 or 2009. And that book was the first place I ever learned about a potential connection between glucose and insulin and Alzheimer's disease. And not having any real personal connection to it, I just sort of filed it away in the back of my mind, like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I'll look into that some other time. And then when 2012 came and I was doing my master's thesis, when I had to pick a topic, I said, what is a topic that I could write? I was doing a literature review rather than an original experiment. So I just had to do a deep dive into research on some particular topic. And I said, what is something that I could do this thesis on that I would genuinely enjoy writing, like enjoy learning about, something that hasn't been written about to death already, and something that there would be enough research that I could write a thesis on it. And I said, I'm going to look into that Alzheimer's stuff. Let me see if there's any literature on that. And I was just stunned, like blown over by what I found in the medical journals on this. They actually regularly refer to Alzheimer's disease now as type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And after I wrote my thesis, I couldn't imagine keeping it to myself. I felt like I had stumbled upon this gold mine of information that nobody knew existed. Nobody was talking about it. And I just said, like, I cannot keep this to myself. I can't sit on this. So I turned it into a little PDF that was available just on my website. And I was very, very lucky in that a publishing company saw it and they offered me a book deal, which is like unheard of. I didn't have to pitch it. I didn't have to do a proposal.
Yeah, but the fact that they came to you.
Exactly. It was a great way to start getting this in what I believe is potentially life-saving information, to get this into the hands of the people who need it most, which is the loved ones and the caregivers of people with dementia who are not hearing any of this from their neurologists. They're not hearing it from their family doctors. And I mean, I wrote my book because nobody beat me to it. I shouldn't have had to write this book. A nutritionist should not have had to write this book. A doctor should have written it. A neurologist should have written it, but they didn't. So,
well, and kudos for you for being, because me in my personal head junk, I've had to battle, like, do I have the credentials? Do I have the right to be saying this stuff? I know if I was in your shoes, I would have had that self-talk, being like, I'm not a doctor, I'm not, I'm not a neurologist.
I do have that. Even with the book out, I'm like, who am I to be writing this? I'm not a medical doctor, but I mean, it's all it is the information. People can look up the scientific references. I didn't make this up. It's not fiction.
Right.
But I face that too. I think maybe even medical doctors do have that sort of, we call it imposter syndrome.
Yes.
Who am I to be doing this? I don't know anything about this. But it's I don't pretend to have all the answers, but there is enough crucial information that it needed to get out there regardless of who was saying it. And I do feel scared sometimes that somebody's going to come after me, like, who are you to be writing this book?
Yeah.
But I just lost my whole train of thought. What happened?
Well, the thing is,
Oh no, I know. I was going to say, like, I'm too small for somebody to worry about me. I'm a nobody, at least for now. Like, no, I'm not worth anybody's time to attack, basically.
Well,
at least not yet.
I hope this book continues to go viral, and I hope it really catches fire, because it, like I said, what I love about your book, and I love the fact that you had that bravery to get over that self-talk that we're, discussing, that you were able to be like, you know what, this information needs to be out there, and kudos to you for putting it out there. And as far as your book goes, it is so well cited and well sourced that for people to, if I make a recommendation for somebody to read the book and they're like, oh, well, she's not a doctor, I'm going to be like, you read the citations and the sourcing. You dive into that like I have, and it's legit. It's legit science. It's so well-founded science that how can it really be argued? It's kind of like arguing gravity at this point. It is so well documented, yet it's just people don't know about it.
Yeah, that's exactly why I wrote my book. I mean, this information is all over the scientific literature, but nobody's bringing it to the people that need it. Nobody's writing an English like a plain English translation of what's going on in these laboratories and the universities. I mean, the research is fascinating, and it's there's a lot of smoking guns. We certainly do have a lot of unanswered questions, but that doesn't mean that we have no answers. And considering there is really no effective pharmaceutical treatment for this condition at all, there's a couple of drugs that do very, very little to retard the disease progression. So being that there's essentially no effective treatment for this, can we start taking things in another direction? Can we start looking for other avenues to treat this, other avenues of why it might be occurring and what to do about it? We are not powerless. They make it sound like we're completely clueless, like we have no idea why this happens or what to do about it. And all I can say is, again, we don't have all the answers, but when it comes to things like heart disease or type 2 diabetes or obesity or different other conditions, we take it for granted that diet and lifestyle play at least some role.
Yes.
We take that as a fact. Nobody debates that. Nobody even argues that. Nobody pretends like that's not true.
Right.
And yet when it comes to Alzheimer's, we throw our hands up like, oh, we're just clueless. We have no idea. We're completely helpless. And to me, that's like, no, that's how can we do this?
Right. No, exactly. And that's the thing, it's a popular saying in genetics and in science, but you quoted in your book, paraphrasing it, it's kind of like, genetics loads the gun, but diet and lifestyle pulls the trigger. And that's so true. It makes such an impact that we kind of take for granted. And like you said, with Alzheimer's, it's just the kind of attitude around it's just been like, well, it might happen to you, and if it does, kind of too bad. And what I love about your book is that it shows not only ways to, it's big on prevention, what if you're at a high risk, or basically anybody really, not just if you're at a high risk, steps that we can take to minimize the risk of it for folks with dementia or Alzheimer's or cognitive decline, steps that we can take to either slow down the progression, maybe even get a little bit of reversal depending on the severities. Folks who are very severe, we might not be able to get any reversal, but maybe we can get some sort of improvement. And that's what I love about your book, is that it really goes deep on explaining the etiology of it and explaining this, giving clear steps of action items that we can take, because Alzheimer's, it's terrible on multiple fronts. I mean, it's such a tragic disease that, as they say, it's not necessarily bad for the sufferer, but the loved ones who are taking care of them, and
Right.
that have to work with people that they've loved and known for decades and years, and to see them degenerate. What a tragic story. And then also from, on a nationality, speaking US wise, the economics of what this is going to be doing, not just currently, but in the future, to the cost of our health care in this country is just astounding.
It's a huge burden financially and emotionally. You're right. I mean, for the caregivers and the loved ones, it's devastating, and not only is it bankrupting the country. I mean, we've got the baby boomer generation that is, going to be headed toward this precipice if they're not already. And not only is it going to bankrupt the national health, finances, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, but individual families
Yep.
suffer huge financial burdens if,
Yep.
especially if somebody has to quit working to become a full-time caregiver or to pay for a long-term care facility. I mean, this is no joke. And it is time to stop pretending like we have no clue why this is happening or what to do about it. We've got to do something.
Exactly. So, well, let's talk about that. Give my listeners a bit of a breakdown on the real cause of the illness, what it's kind of been thought by the mass public, and then actually what the science is showing us is really causing this disease.
Well, it's hard to say what the actual cause is. We could speculate about what is causing the problem, but the fundamental problem in Alzheimer's disease is that neurons in affected areas of the brain have lost the ability to get energy from glucose.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like to say that Alzheimer's disease is a metabolic problem. And by metabolic, I mean it has to do with the way the brain is getting energy.
Right.
And if the brain has lost the ability to get energy from glucose, then these neurons start to atrophy and they start to wither and they die, and the connections between them are lost. And
Yep.
it's basically a fuel crisis. It's an energy shortage in the brain. And this is actually measurable in people at risk for Alzheimer's as young as their 30s and 40s. I mean, Alzheimer's disease does not spontaneously develop overnight. Nobody wakes up one day all of a sudden and they have severe dementia.
Right.
This is something that builds over decades, but when somebody's younger, the brain is robust. It's able to compensate for some of this fuel shortage. But over time, as this progresses, the brain is no longer able to overcome this, and that's when you start showing the signs and symptoms. And the logical outcome of what's going to happen when the brain is starved for fuel is going to be memory loss and confusion and behavioral changes and personality disturbances. And why is that happening? I think it has a lot to do with what we've been eating and how we've been living the last several decades. I mean, Alzheimer's disease is not a new condition, but it is certainly exploding in the same way type 2 diabetes is, in the same way obesity is, and heart disease. I mean, I don't think those are unconnected. And so I mentioned earlier that they call this type 3 diabetes or
Yes.
diabetes of the brain because, it has to do with glucose metabolism in the brain.
Yeah.
And people listening might be thinking, if they know somebody with Alzheimer's, well, grandpa's not diabetic, or, my wife has Alzheimer's, but she's not diabetic. The problem with that is there's a big problem with how type 2 diabetes is diagnosed.
Yes.
And if I just say diabetes, people, please know that I'm referring to type 2, not type 1. That's something very different. So type 2 diabetes is typically diagnosed only by looking at measurements of glucose. They look at your fasting blood sugar or your A1C, which is like a longer term average measurement of your blood sugar, or they give you that oral glucose tolerance test where they make you chug down this glucose drink and they measure your blood glucose at intervals afterward.
Yep.
None of those measurements look at insulin.
Right.
And there are, without exaggeration, millions upon millions of people walking around right now with normal blood sugar and normal hemoglobin A1C, but those things are only normal because their insulin is through the roof, and that insulin is keeping it in check.
Right.
And it's this high insulin that's actually contributing to the Alzheimer's. So there's a couple of different risk factors for Alzheimer's, but one of the biggest is chronic hyperinsulinemia, and that's just a big word that means your insulin levels are too high too much of the time.
Yeah.
That is a risk factor independent of genetics, independent of family history, and independent of having type 2 diabetes, because type 2 diabetes is a risk factor for Alzheimer's, but you've got millions of people who are not diagnosed diabetics but who have raging hyperinsulinemia.
Right, and that's one thing that I really, really loved about your book, because, you know, when we talk, and we can talk about this more about later on when we talk about kind of steps that we can take, but maybe we should be checking, you know, fasting insulin levels versus fasting glucose levels and that type of stuff, because when we look at the science, not just in Alzheimer's and everything, but the science between insulin resistance or chronically high insulin levels leading to insulin resistance in different ways and everything, and then also generalized systemic inflammation and arterial disease and just type 2 diabetes, on and on and on. You know, it looks like when we look at chronically high insulin levels, what all in a broad scope in medicine can that affect through the whole body? Like, give me some examples. Like we talked about Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes. What else can chronically high insulin levels, how can that affect us?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because this is huge, and it's just being missed. It's being missed because nobody's measuring insulin. Nobody's making this connection, except if you look into the medical and scientific literature, you will see these connections everywhere between high insulin and, like we said, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, gout, hypertension. If you have high blood pressure, it has almost nothing to do with sodium or how much salt you eat, and everything to do with insulin. There's a small select percentage of people that are sodium sensitive. Most people, high blood pressure has nothing to do with salt intake. PCOS is well known to be related to hyperinsulinemia. That's polycystic ovarian syndrome. They actually sometimes call that diabetes of the ovaries. Some people actually find acne resolves upon a low-carb diet. So whether that's to insulin or just food sensitivities, that maybe they eliminate some of those foods. Gynecomastia, which is the development of breast tissue in men, like, the man boobs, the moobs, as they call them. Erectile dysfunction, cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is an insulin problem. The number one killer of type 2 diabetics is cardiovascular disease.
Right.
And it's because of the damage from the glucose and from the insulin to the actual physical structure of the blood vessels. If you have cardiovascular disease, get your insulin tested, because it really has nothing to do with saturated fat or butter or red meat. And there's more, like abdominal obesity, that apple shape where you have relatively thin arms and legs, but you look like you have a beach ball in your stomach, like just a big belly. Yeah. They how they used to call that the beer belly. Yeah. Dr. William Davis wrote the book. He calls it a wheat belly. Some doctors, I've heard call it the insulin pouch.
Yeah, I think that's a much more apt term for it. When talking about that and insulin levels and everything, what tests do you recommend as far as getting your insulin levels tested? So if somebody listening to this wants to get checked out or thinks that might be at risk or something, what tests do you recommend?
The easiest thing to do is a fasting insulin test. Unfortunately, there's no way to measure insulin at home like you can with glucose. You get one of
Yeah.
those little handheld glucometers.
Yeah.
You do have to get it done at a lab or a doctor's office, but it's very easy. It's just a blood test. You have to ask your doctor for it. In my opinion, it should be a standard part of routine blood work, because
Yeah.
if it was, it would be a total game changer. But for now, you have to specifically ask for it. But here's the deal. If your fasting insulin level is normal, and by normal we tend to mean single digits, we want it below 10. Some people will say they want to see it below 5 or below 7. That's up for debate, but definitely if you're in the double digits, you're in trouble. If your fasting insulin is normal, but you still have signs and symptoms of a high insulin condition, then you might want to do something called the Kraft test, which is where they give you that oral glucose tolerance test, but instead of only testing your glucose, they test your insulin as well. And that's how you can see, even if your blood sugar is normal, you can see that your insulin is super, super high. I think most people will have a high fasting insulin if they have a problem, but there are exceptions. So it may be worth, like I said, if the fasting level is normal, but you know that you have a lot of signs and symptoms of high insulin, then you could get that other test.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that more later, but that's where this whole individualized nutrition and individualized testing needs to go, is that there's not going to be one size fits all. We can try to do something about the 80-20 rule, kind of do the things that's going to make the most impact, or catch do the best diagnostics for the most people, but you're always going to have those outliers. So even though if we set general guidelines, know that we still may need to tweak to individual tolerances and risk factors. So
Right.
Well, it seems to me, when you talked about this a little bit earlier with the drug therapy and how it's just been so lackluster. I mean, it's just been disappointing on all fronts, the efficacy of these drugs in development for Alzheimer's. And me personally, and you can tell me what you think about this, it seems like it's because drugs usually are trying to do specific things, isolate specific factors, and a disease like this, it seems to be so multifactorial. What are the most popular drug treatments being used for Alzheimer's, and why haven't they had much of an impact?
Good question. You are exactly right. This is a very complex, multifactorial condition. And so when we have drugs that target one single molecule or one single pathway, it's really no wonder there isn't a whole lot of improvement. Dr. Dale Bredesen, who's done a ton of work in reversing early Alzheimer's and cognitive impairment, which is the precursor to Alzheimer's, he says he compares Alzheimer's to a roof with like 36 holes. And if you patch 6 of the holes, that's great, but you still got 30 holes.
Right.
So you can't just do this piecemeal like one at a time. Most of the drugs for this condition right now are what we call acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. And it basically acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that helps with memory processing and learning and general cognitive function. And so these drugs are designed to inhibit the breakdown of this neurotransmitter, meaning the assumption is that if more of this particular compound stays active in your brain, it will boost memory and cognition. It's the same thing as like an SSRI, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which they try to use for depression. Except these cholinesterase inhibitors really don't have a whole lot of impact on the brain. They just don't. Maybe very, very mild slowdown of disease progression. The disease still progresses. You still get worse. It just happens a little more slowly than it might without the drug.
Yeah, exactly. And, in theory, it seems like it would be a good idea, but when we actually look at the application and the effects, it just has not had the effects that we want, and I think it's just because they're not getting to the root cause of it.
Exactly. And I'm not saying there's no place for these drugs, but let's combine these drugs with a therapy that gets at the heart of this disease. I mean, none of the drugs reverse this fuel shortage that I talked about before.
Yeah.
None of these drugs do anything to nourish and feed these starving brain cells,
Right.
but there are treatments that can, and you don't need pharmaceutical drugs to do them.
Right. And, speaking of that, listeners, we're going to geek out a little bit here, but I'm going to let you know that we're going to break things down. We're going to be using some scientific terms, but we're going to kind of break down what they mean so it doesn't sound so sciencey and scary. But in your book, you talk a good deal about beta amyloid plaques and how they're implicated with Alzheimer's. That's seems to be where a lot of folks are trying to put the blame on Alzheimer's as far as a causative mechanism. They're trying to develop drugs, it seems like, that tries to break up these amyloid plaques, and it hasn't really seemed to go anywhere so far. But these amyloid plaques, it seems that it may not be the smoking gun that the researchers are trying to say that they are. Can you explain a little bit to my listeners what these plaques are, the etiology behind them, and why they might not be the causative factors that some people think?
Yeah, I would love to. This is a huge issue with this disease. You asked before what the sort of conventional paradigm is of what they think Alzheimer's is and why it's happening. And a lot of doctors and researchers think that these so-called amyloid plaques are the cause of Alzheimer's disease. And these amyloid plaques, they start out as proteins, amyloid proteins that are secreted by some of these cells.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a normal process. It's a normal metabolic byproduct.
Yes.
There's no evidence that people with Alzheimer's produce more of these amyloid proteins. The problem seems to be that they are not cleared away in a timely manner.
Mm-hmm.
And because they're not cleared away, they sort of accumulate and solidify inside and outside of the cells. And you can think of it like these plaques literally gunking up the brain, like they get in the way of these cells being able to communicate with each other. It's almost like blocking the fire door in a building. Like this is a crisis. Like if there was a fire, people can't get out.
Yeah.
That's kind of how these plaques are. They prevent these messages between the cells from being transmitted. Now, the thing about these plaques or these proteins is a lot of people with Alzheimer's disease do not have a large plaque burden in their brain.
Right.
And then some people who die from other causes and have their brains autopsied after death, they do have a lot of plaque deposition, but they had no signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's.
Right.
So right away, that tells us either these plaques are not a cause of Alzheimer's or they're not the main cause. The other thing is, like you mentioned, there have been a lot of drugs developed to go after these plaques, assuming, okay, if these plaques are causing Alzheimer's disease, if we can find a drug that reduces the formation of this plaque, then that's a slam dunk. This should be a really good drug for Alzheimer's disease. Except every one of these drugs has been a total failure.
Yeah.
And they've been successful in that they have reduced the formation of these amyloid plaques. However, reducing these amyloid plaques has not had a positive impact upon this disease. It's exactly like the cholesterol with statins. A statin drug does lower your cholesterol, but having a lower cholesterol does not guarantee you not having a heart attack or not having cardiovascular disease.
I was just about to say that, there was that recent study that showed, was it half or over half of the people suffering from a heart attack had low cholesterol?
Exactly.
And so how can we still blame cholesterol?
Right. So how can we still blame the amyloid plaques?
Yes.
And so there's a couple more really interesting things to know about these plaques. One is the enzyme that's supposed to clear away these proteins before they have a chance to form into these plaques is called insulin degrading enzyme.
Right.
And that's exactly what it sounds like. It is an enzyme that gets rid of insulin after it's done its job. I mean, hormones can't linger in the blood forever, so we have enzymes that come along and clear them away. So insulin degrading enzyme not only clears away insulin, it also clears away a couple of other hormones as well as these amyloid proteins. And if the thing is, though, if you have chronically high insulin all the time, this enzyme is too busy dealing with all the insulin, thus leaving these amyloid proteins to accumulate and solidify. So
Yeah.
it's almost like it's in competition with insulin for this enzyme, and this enzyme will always go toward insulin instead. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it's just these plaques. It's really funny. They actually are not supposed to technically diagnose Alzheimer's disease until somebody dies and they look at the brain and they find the plaques.
Oh, really?
Um, yeah, it's just kind of like they diagnose you with Alzheimer's type dementia or something
A
until they can actually.
posthumous diagnosis, huh?
Well, it is because the diagnosis is supposed to be based on the presence of these plaques in the brain. But again, many people who die from Alzheimer's don't have a huge plaque burden, and a lot of people who die from other causes do have plaque.
Wow.
Now, these amyloid proteins, Dr. Bredesen is doing some work in this area, and some other researchers have done work in this area. It looks more and more like these amyloid proteins are actually protective. This is the brain's way of trying to protect itself. Now, these proteins inhibit some of the enzymes involved in glucose metabolism. So we said earlier that the main thing going wrong in the Alzheimer's brain is that these cells are no longer able to get energy from glucose.
Yeah.
So if these plaques are or these proteins are interfering with that, it kind of makes sense. Wow, these proteins must be causing Alzheimer's because they are interfering with the glucose metabolism.
Right.
But I and some other people that know far more than I do, we actually look at this as this is the brain's way of protecting itself. It's actually saying, I don't want any more glucose. I'm actually going to forcibly limit the amount of glucose the brain is using. Please give me some other fuel.
I see.
The problem is in the modern American or modern Western diet, there is no other fuel. When
Right.
people eat a high carbohydrate diet, glucose is the primary fuel for the brain.
Yeah.
So if the brain can't use glucose, that is a huge, huge crisis.
Right. And we'll get into that a little bit about metabolic flexibility and the role of ketones in brain health and all that stuff here in a little bit. But, getting back to that whole, there's that saying in the low-carb community, don't blame butter for what bread did.
Right, right. Huh.
And, it seems to me like, we should also put that towards, with this high insulin or this chronic insulin load that we have, or the damages through glycation and oxidation, which we'll get into later, and all that stuff. We maybe should also coin a phrase like don't blame cholesterol for what high insulin and glycation did in heart attacks, and don't blame beta amyloid plaques for what chronically high insulin levels did for Alzheimer's.
Exactly. And I'm not saying that these amyloid proteins and plaques are not problematic at all. They are.
Yeah, because they
But
do change
why?
the structure of things and in
Right.
science, form equals function. So if you change the form or the structure of proteins, they change function or lose their inherent function.
Correct. Yes. So these things are not entirely harmless, but they are, I want to say definitely, but I don't think we can say that they are seemingly really not the primary fundamental cause of this illness. They may even be a protective factor. And at least, thank goodness, more and more researchers are saying this, because we have spent billions of dollars and several years, if not decades, chasing drugs to go after these amyloid proteins with basically nothing to show for that. No improvement in this condition whatsoever.
Right. It keeps going back to getting to the root cause of things. There is I forget who said it, and it's going to come to me right after we finish recording. But somebody had paraphrased, when cutting down the tree of evil, you will find for every 100 people hacking at the limbs, you'll find one person hacking at the root. And,
Right.
That's what we should be doing, is focusing on the root. Yeah, so very good. Well, going back to Alzheimer's being nicknamed type 3 diabetes, why that seems, as we learn more about insulin, that may be an apt description, but it also might not be a very apt description for everybody with Alzheimer's. Can you help me unpack that a little bit here?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean. Are you asking if everybody with Alzheimer's has high insulin, or?
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying, because Alzheimer's being nicknamed type 3 diabetes, it's catchy and it sounds applicable, but is that applicable to every person with Alzheimer's?
That's a good question. No, I don't think everyone with Alzheimer's, well, I don't think everyone with Alzheimer's has high insulin, but I also think there are multiple forms of dementia that are being called Alzheimer's that are not actually. To me, Alzheimer's should be defined by the reduced brain usage of glucose. It's an energy problem. There might be other forms of dementia due to like traumatic brain injury or some trauma, or even
they played sports. How many concussions did they have during their?
Yeah, and oddly enough, I don't know a whole lot about this, but I've heard that there are some people who, following a surgery where they had anesthesia, they start to develop some dementia symptoms relatively quickly after the anesthesia. But I wouldn't consider that Alzheimer's. That may be some form of cognitive impairment, but to me, that's not Alzheimer's. Now, this, like we said before, when we are talking about Alzheimer's, it is multifactorial. So it may not be that they all have high insulin or, high glucose. It may be that they have rampant oxidative stress, rampant inflammation, which those terms are also kind of bandied about without anyone really knowing what they are. But what I would say is, just in general, these people just might have, how do I say it, like metabolic problems and not sleeping enough, not getting enough exercise, but that may not be reflected in a high insulin all the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Well, Amy, if I want to be respectful of your time, we're already 50 minutes into this. Are you still good for going a bit longer here?
Yeah, I have time.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and break this up into 2 parts. So this will be the first half of the episode. So, all right, Ketodontist listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to this first half of this interview with Amy Berger. I hope you got a lot of information out of it with Alzheimer's, the role of insulin, why drug therapies necessarily aren't working, and what might seem to be the root cause for all of this. Now, I really, really encourage you to tune into part 2, because now we're really going to be getting into some of the science of it. And if you're a nerd like me and who enjoys that, this is going to be really fun. So thank you for tuning in to part 1 with our interview with Amy Berger. Until I see you again, take care.